Good morning, everybody. Please join me in welcoming Duncan and Lucky to take us into a deep dive into Patch. Cool.
Thank you. So I'm super excited to be here. This is my first JNUC, not my first presentation, but I've been fortunate enough to present with Lucky, where it's not his first JNUC. But however,
first time presenting, so bear with me.
Yeah. Excellent. If you want to kick us off.
Sure. So today, thank you again for coming today. We're going to dive a little bit into Patch. And we're going to go into specifically understand how versioning control, what it is, and how complex it can be. And so we're basically going to put it into a microscope and go through basically what Jamf has offered the last few years here, talk about some API endpoints and how to integrate an external patch source, and then how to kind of configure patch definitions as well with that. So we're going to go through and understand a patch definition thoroughly in all the aspects of that. Cool. And I'm going to throw it to Duncan.
Okay, cool. So a little bit about version control to start with. It's not as simple as it initially seems on the surface. And it could be deemed as an entire topic. In fact, not to pimp another presentation or another conference here, but I did a presentation on version control a couple of years back at another conference. If you follow that URL and look for the session titled, "Which version is this?" I do a fairly deep dive into the constructs of version strings and all sorts of other fun things that vendors don't do, like have standards. So that being said, in the context of Jamp, so when we put it there, version information is basically the best place to look for it is in the inventory data. And so the default locations that the inventory collects the data from is from the info p list in the application bundle, and it uses the CF bundle short version string, except for when it doesn't. There is one case that I know of where this is not actually the thing, and it uses the CF bundle version string, the CF bundle version, yes, string for gathering information about Microsoft Office products, and that, I believe, was to cater for the same version number being in the 64-bit and the 32-bit versions when Microsoft were doing the transition. Other than that, you start to look into the aspect of extension attributes for gathering version information for products that do not have their versions stored in, I guess, the standard location.
So it's sometimes kind of complicated to find that versioning itself, but then now when you finally have it, how do you compare it, right? And so there's two methods right now. You can either compare the strings or you can do a lookup of the strings. And so comparison has its pros and cons. And comparison gives you a relative state, right? It's either not there, it's either greater, equal to, or less than. And then comparison requires consistency in the object that the string value that you're bringing back. And as we know fully well, versions are not the same across all apps. And then comparison works most of the time. But then, as we'll find out here soon too as well, that it's not a solution for everything.
So, like, just to further extrapolate on that, there's also different comparison mechanisms which you need to look at, because if you look at something lexically, it can compare different to something if you look at it numerically or if you're looking at it in a different way. So comparison has its difficulties in the sense of not only do you have to have consistency within the version strings, you also have to have the required method to compare the versions. So that brings us to lookup. So lookup doesn't actually care about consistency because you have the information there and you are just matching that information. So this is the mechanism that is embedded in Jamf Pro's patch model. The disadvantage with lookup, it is reactive. So you have to populate the information to look up against and order all of those values in the way that you can correctly identify that relative state that a comparison can do in most of the situations. But the one thing about lookup is you don't have to care about the consistency, so it's going to work all of the time. And that's kind of important. And from the outside perspective looking in, I can see exactly why Jamf have chosen this method to do it, because they're providing patch definitions to so many environments. You need to have a consistent and reliable way to do it so that it's going to work the same way every single time.
All right. Cool. So what has Jamp offered so far? And so you realize, as you see, in 993, we released patch reporting, right? So to tackle this complex problem of finding out what versions are for the apps that we supported currently at the time, I think we released only about 33 or so, we provided reporting. And then in 10, we provided patch management, which offered you a solution to develop your own policies to act against that reporting in your environment, right? And finally, in 10.2, we then heard your cries to support all various apps out there that we currently did not support at the time. And so we we released external patch sources, which then now you can customize and support your own definitions, and then integrate that back into that. And so Duncan's going to lead us into what that means.
So the patch endpoint is, it's an API to API communication. So the endpoint provides an API that Jamf Pro will read in. So the API has a bunch of nodes on it that we can talk to get information out. The first of which is the software node. So the software node provides a title list of all of the patch definitions that are on the server. That are on the patch API or the patch API server, whatever. And as we can see, it's a lot of information. So the data structure is a JSON, and Jamf Pro interprets that and passes it into the database and leverages that information and compares against it for lookup. You can filter this down with IDs, so this can be plural, so use comma-separate IDs after you hit the endpoint. And we can just pick a single title out and we can get the information about that. So the summary, the exec summary information about that particular software title. Now, these, by the way, these screenshots are actually from Jamf's supplied patch definitions, and we'll see what happens when we hit that with the patch. So the patch itself, where we know the ID of the software title we're looking for, brings back all of the information, all of the version information for that particular product. And a patch definition looks like this when you hit up the Jamf server. But you can see there's a bunch of garbage code at the start and the end. That's actually the code signature, because these, the ones that Jamf is supplying, are code signed. So if we strip that out, we actually see a JSON structure similar to before, but I've actually formatted this one nicely so you can read it and get a general idea to do it.
Cool. So that's just kind of a brief, quick look at what the definition looks like. So when you're setting up in a patch external source and you're trying to integrate that into patch into your JSS, there are three things that you kind of have to remember here. And so that if you're using SSL, the Java key store underpinning Tomcat Pro must be trusted. Must trust the SSL cert for the endpoint, right? So that's the first catch there. Duncan and his team ran into this so many times that they've created a feature request out there. 7546, you can go out there, check it out, and upvote that. So they include that in the future. And then additionally, for third-party software definitions, the Jamf Pro doesn't recognize the code signature of that. And so currently right now, you'll run into that issue as well. And so Duncan and his team has also created another feature request, 7545, that you can go ahead and upvote as well.
Please upvote our stuff. It'd be really good. It'd make their life easier.
And last to remember is that the endpoint, when you're setting it up and you're testing it, you need to have a valid definition within your patch definition. And so it's going to come back error in, error out if you don't have that. And so just make sure that you have that in there before you test it.
Okay, so we've covered the abstract of what everything is. So there are a couple of patch projects out there, both open source. Jamf's Bryce and Terrell has created a Python-based patch server that you can supply the JSON files to, and it will publish them for you to be able to connect to, which you can stand up your own instance. And
Yeah.
this is a screenshot of the website. Yes, I forgot I did that. So you know when you're in the right place when you see that.
Right.
And
Cool.
also...
And another solution is called Kenobi. And it's a solution that Duncan and his team from OnData has created, spent the last year creating. And it's actually a Jamp supported integration into Jamf Pro. And so meaning that our support staff is trained to support it. And we know how, and you can actually create a Jamf support ticket directly against it. And so, yep.
Yeah. So that's the open source website for the project, if you hit it up. And so you can get there and you can download it and you can use it all you want. So a little more on this. So we're actually going to dive into the protocol and the endpoints and structures and all of the bits and pieces that go behind it. Jamf have released a tech article, which is 497 at Jamf Nation, which is well worth a look in because it will go through all of the stuff that we're going to ramble on about and And maybe we'll miss something, maybe we won't, I don't know. And that has like great detail about the structure of the patch objects themselves, but we'll get to that too. We also have put up an article in the an article in the wiki for the Kenobi's Git repository. So if you follow that URL, you can go there and we can look through it. But we did come up with a very nice infographic that explains the definition. So it gives you the structure, how it wraps up, and how everything is encapsulated in each other. You'll notice that in this graphic there are a couple of things that are grayed out, because at the moment they're provisioned for but not yet used in the patch's capability. So the big tickets to highlight out here, the EA's object, you can only have a single extension attribute in the patch definition at the moment, otherwise it will excuse me, error when you're attempting to import the definitions into Jamf Pro. Everything can only have a single component at the moment. So a component makes up a human readable title for what the patch is for. And at the moment, there is no support for suites of products or having multiple components clustered together, but it is provisioned for in the structure, so that may or may not come in the future, but right now the data structure requires it. So it's a one-to-one relationship right through from the patch to its actual exacting criteria, but it's got a wrapper around it being the component. There is a dependencies object in there, which is no longer used, and that effectively needs to be present, but is an unused object at the moment, but it may come to be in use in the future. So that structure corresponds to actually how it's stored in the Jamp Pro database. So the objects in the patch definition all marry up to the Jamp Pro database. It's very modular, it is very extensible, so you can do a lot of stuff with it, and you can scale it quite well. And as I've indicated, not everything is used, and on the surface it seems like there is some duplication or a lot of duplication of information, but some of those elements in the patch definition are used for reporting purposes or just to make it human readable in the UI. Whereas others are actually used for programmatic purposes in the back end.
Cool, so let's jump into the object types of a patch definition, right? And so first you're gonna see here that we have a software title. It kind of contains all of the objects, as well, again, as Duncan mentioned, some other info. The patch object, which contains the actual version that you're looking for, components that are objects within the patch itself, and then extension attributes that can be used to determine the version, as we talked about. Sometimes you'll just need to find them in various locations. Right? Another one is kill apps, apps that need to be killed in order for successful install, and then a criteria object that covers multiple things, and we'll actually get into that in a little bit here.
Okay, so let's break down the software title object. Initially, there are a batch of strings that you need to do. Name, which is the name of the software title that we're looking for. The publisher, which is, these are mostly sorting and human readable factors here. So the publisher or the vendor that releases the software, there are a couple of keys in here that are now deprecated. So there's the app name and the bundle ID, because as I mentioned before that there's a lot of duplication of information, sometimes this information changes through versions of the product. And so having it stored at the top level of the patch was not actually usable. So these things are no longer referenced. There is the time it was last modified, which is an ISO 8601 timestamp, which is what tells Jamf Pro when the patch definition was updated. This is not when the product was last updated. That is stored somewhere that's else. So Jamf Pro, when it talks to an external patch API, hits and it looks up by the ID, which is just a text, like an alphanumeric text value, which uniquely identifies the title on an external source. So it compares the title and the last modified date. If there is a change, it will then refresh the definition from the external source. And the current version is also a reference lookup point, but it's used for the reporting component in Jamf Pro for things that are not on the latest version of the product. The software title also has some additional objects embedded in it, requirements, which is a criteria object, and we'll get to those in a bit. The actual patch objects themselves, and the extension attribute object.
Right. Cool. And so let's look at to the patch object itself now. Within that, you have an app version that you're specifying. The vendor release date, this is what Duncan was referring to. This is actually when the vendor has released the definition. Again, that's an ISO 8601 format. A standalone flag to just kind of flag whether that's a standalone install. The minimum operating system, which is only used for reporting purposes, and then a reboot flag, which is kind of like the reboot if a package requires a flag in policies. Right? In addition to that, there are also other objects that are contained in patch, which includes, again, the KLabs components, which are kind of like requirements, capabilities, and then kind of dependencies. Right? And dependencies, again, we mentioned, exists in there and is a requirement of the definition, but it's not populated. Right.
Okay, so breaking down the component part. So the component has two effectively human readable values. And my interpretation of this is it's the name of the product that we want to patch, and the version of the product. So you might find that there is a product out there that has a version string which is not usually human readable. I think Adobe Lightroom is a classic for this, where it has some form of hex value in brackets after the name of the product inside the version string, but they publish it as being released as like 8.1 or whatever. And so this is a way for you to abstract that to make it easy for you to read in the UI or in Jamf Pro's UI. So this is a reference version, not an actual version of the patch. It does not have to marry up to the actual version of the patch that you are doing. And the component also contains a single criteria, it contains multiple criteria at the moment, but you can only have one component per patch at this point in time, as I iterated before.
Cool, and so the extension attribute object itself contains a key, which is the name of the extension attribute. A note here is that if you create extension attributes in your environment to make sure that you're not duplicating things, because actually the patch whatever name you give the patch extension attribute will conflict, and then you won't be able to create that. The value of the extension attribute, which is base64 encoded script, and then the display name, which is actually shown in the patch definition itself, right? And so, we just want to warn that to use extension attributes sparingly because it can get really complicated.
I just got to say, man, you talk nearly as fast as I do. It's great. But this is going to go quick.
I think it's catching on.
Anyway, so the KillApps object, which I think is a nasty name for an exacting term, but it basically tells Jamf Pro to tell what apps need to quit when you're doing the installation of a particular patch. It identifies the application with the bundle ID, and the app name is what is displayed in the notification dialog when you do it. So just one thing to note about the KillApps object when you populate it, it's not graceful for the user. They get a notification. If the notification timeout exceeds the app is quit, they will lose whatever's open at the time. Right. So just bear that in the back of your mind.
And then finally, we get to criteria, right? And criteria is very much, you guys are used to smart groups. It's very much just like, excuse me, smart groups. Includes name, operator value, and type. And then you can kind of, create them together, and it'll just and them all together, right? And that's it.
Particular note, the smart groups in patch definition do not have parentheses. Yep. So, but I'll touch on that a little bit later on, because it's a bit of an art form when you get to actually building them without the parentheses and you have multiple criteria. It can get fun, or send you insane. One of those two things, probably the latter. So actually creating a definition. There's a couple of ways to do this. The basic and very obvious way is to hand cut the JSON. And as you can see, the JSON object it's not too bad. It's reasonably straightforward, but it's prone to having typos, and don't put commas in the wrong place, which I do all the time. It's not great. And there's a lot of information in it. So I believe that this is like Google Chrome from a couple of weeks ago. But as you can see, that when we format the code so it's readable, you've got 4,500 lines of it. So this could be potentially very time-consuming. And also very prone to error and very frustrating when you're testing it. And when you copy and paste chunks of code, it can be a little bit tedious. So that being said, when Lucky mentioned we created the patch endpoint, we also decided to bang an editor on the front end of it to make that a little bit easier for everyone. And as he said, we've open sourced the product, so feel free to jump onto it, grab hold of it, and have a play with it.
It's awesome.
Thank you. So I'm just going to actually use this because the structure of the UI, actually, I can marry it up quite nicely to the infographic I did before, and I'll actually walk through the way you structure and create a patch definition. You can visualize this as being blocks of JSON if you want. I really don't recommend that. So first of all, we would just click the new button in the top right, and that will create a software title object. So if you look back at in your brain at the infographic I showed beforehand, that's the software title object. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to populate the strings inside that before we create the other objects. And we're going to put in everything around that. I'm picking on Chrome today. I like picking on Chrome. And then we save that. And so the UI is reporting that, OK, we've created our software title, so we've got our software title object, everything's good. It's given us a warning. But that's basically because there's no content in it, so it's an incomplete definition. This can't be worked with, moving on. So the next thing that we need to create is, the next thing that we need to do, software title, yeah, it's created, it's all good. So drilling into the software title object, you can see a bunch of tabs that we have here that actually walk you through all of the different components. The first thing is an extension attribute, but Chrome's inventory data is obtainable through, Chrome's version is obtainable through inventory data, so we're not going to have to worry about an extension attribute, so we're going to leave that out. We need the criteria. So this is the part that helps us determine if any version of the software is installed. So it's a generic thing that is unique to that software title, is probably the best way I can put it. The recommended method to use is to use the application bundle identifier. That is the default in all of the Jamf Pro patch definitions, and that's the one that we use when we're creating definitions. So you throw in the application bundle ID as your criteria. You give it a value, which I think it's done. And this is something that I'm incredibly proud of. So we don't actually store JSON files in the back end of this. We store it all in a local database. It doesn't have to be configured or anything like that. Everything self-configures when you set it up. But it's got an asynchronous save because there's such teeny tiny little bursts of data that don't get hit very often that once you tab out of the field, it will automatically save it and give you the feedback of a nice little green tick. And undos do work if you're changing something. So you can just hit Command-Z and it'll recommit back to whatever it was previously. So I thought that was good, just less clicks. I like less clicks. Next, we're going to have to create a patch object. And so let's do that. And we hit the new button down here. So we go to the Patches tab, we hit the new button. And we populate the patch with some version information. We hit Save. And then we should have a non-functional patch, because the patch has incomplete data in it. But now we have our patch object. So this is good. So we drill into the patch object. And inside that, we'll need to create the components. So our component and the criteria that goes behind that component is to do with creating an exacting version of this software title. So typically it is going to have to contain the same criteria that you had previously. And this is where that whole interesting thing comes down. If a vendor changes its bundle ID, you're going to have two criteria in the initial requirements thing with two independent bundle IDs and an OR value in here. But this one, you will only ever have one because you are picking the bundle ID that marries to the version you want. So we're going to create a couple of criteria. We'll create the component first. And so that's fairly easy, and we've made it human readable. And we'll create the initial criteria, which is the application bundle ID, and we'll populate that. Next. And then we'll have to add a second criteria, which is going to be the exacting version of it. So we're following along? Good? No? Yes?
Drilling
right. It's boring and repetitive. And so we've done that, and so now we have something that identifies this exacting version of Google Chrome. So that's nice and easy. We've got that. Next thing we're going to need is a dependencies object. The tab's available in Kenobi, but you don't use it. It will auto-create the empty array that needs to be living there for you to do this, and so we can just forget that exists. It just gets taken care of. Following that, we need to have capabilities. So the capabilities in particular are effectively what the system requirements are to run the software. So you can add hardware requirements into here OS versions, and other bits and pieces. So we'll go ahead and create the capabilities for Google Chrome, because these are required to exist. So we're going to add an operating system, and we are going to add, and I've screwed a slide. It should be is greater than or equal to, so that's fine. In a hurry to refresh things. So now we have the capabilities, so Google Chrome will install on anything that is greater than or equal to macOS 10.10. And last but not least, we need to have the application that needs to quit when we're doing the install. And this can be multiple apps, because if you've done, can I get a show of hands, please? Who's done Adobe installs? Yeah. How many apps do you have to quit for a successful install? So you can imagine when you go to create a patch definition for an Adobe install, what this list looks like, and then you have to do it for every version. That's fun. Not really. So we'll go ahead and create that. Two very simple values. So it's just the application name, and that's what's displayed in the notification, the bundle ID, which is how Jamf Pro is going to identify that it's running by a process query. So we've got that in there. That's all good and happy. And now we have a complete patch. And also Kenobi is telling us we can enable this now. So everything's there. It's all good. It's been sanity checked. By the way, all the fields have input sanitization on them. So it is vaguely aware of what should be in there. And it will tell you when you do something not quite so good. We won't use the S word. And so we've enabled the patch, and that's good. So we can back out to the software title, and you can see that the info over on the software title tab itself is telling us that it's disabled, but we can now enable this. And we would be able to, at this point in time, once we click the enable and everything's happy, we could actually connect Jamf Pro to our endpoint and pull in this definition and manage one version of Google Chrome. One. Yay! So we do actually have a couple of sample patch defs inside the default database when you stand it up. I suggest you just leave them there and poke around in them, get a look at it, have a feel with it, and all of that sort of things if you want to use it. And now you can just repeat basically everything from patch onwards because of the update cycle of Google Chrome, about 180 times.
And that's just for Chrome.
And that's Chrome. And then you can do it for other things. It's great. It's fun. So anyway, some real tips, having done a couple of these.
Just a couple.
Just a couple. Validate your extension attributes. So what we do when we have to use them, and we use them very sparingly, in fact, it's the absolute last resort. If we can't determine it from version information alone, we will use an extension attribute. But definitely validate the extension attributes. So create it in Jamf Pro, run it, check it, create groups on it, do all of those things first. Once it's good, delete it, and then put it in the patch def. But put it in the patch def before you delete it. That's probably a good idea. Use smart groups for doing pre-testing. So the patch itself actually creates a bunch of transparent smart groups based on the criteria that you set everything up in the background. Now those smart groups, they're all there, they're all used, and they're all created, and they do not need to exist in the main UI of Jamf Pro. But when you are creating your criteria objects, create the smart groups, validate them, check that they work, and then pick them up like for like into Jamf Pro. And then, into the patch definition, and then remove them. Once again, this is an art form. So any users of Casper 7?
Two back there.
Any? Yeah. So do you remember when it didn't have parentheses for the smart groups? Yeah. So we're in that land with patch at the moment. It can be tricky, but it's just a logical step chain. So people know that, can I get a show of hands? Anyone familiar with the two different streams of Adobe Acrobat? So they have what they call a classic track and a continuous track. Okay, so Acrobat shares its bundle ID across every version, but Adobe have two release cycles, and you can't install a classic patch over a continuous base install, and the inverse of that. So you can't install a continuous patch over a classic base install. Unfortunately, the versioning actually marries up. So both classic and continuous had version strings that began with 15 and 17. So they're common across the board. It was the second tuple of the version string that actually was the thing that differentiated them. There was another thing inside the info plist in the application bundle that identified which stream it was coming from. So we could have created an extension attribute here, but as I said, trying to minimize the extension attributes, we were able to do it with smart groups. Now, if too many more versions come out of this, we're going to have smart groups with 10 or 10 plus criteria, and therein lies badness. So we will probably change it over to an extension attribute at that point in time. But you don't want to do things that are creating overhead on your Jamf Pro server, because basically, once you start adding lots of these, you start generating lots of overhead, because there is lots of transparent smart groups, there are lots of extension attributes, there are just lots and lots and lots of things. I learned the hard way that if you import 500 definitions, things tend to go a little bit south. It can do. So in this case, if we look at the graphic, so I'm going to have to, this is very tricky to explain. So the first thing is the bundle identifier, and then we have an and, but you can see the very next flag is an or, and then 2 flags down we have an or. So this is kind of a loop that encapsulates things. So it's going to be bundle ID and version of 15, but not 1506, or version of 17, but not 17008, or version of, or 1711, and not version 1711, or version 18, or version 19. So it can be really confusing, and this is something that you just need to practice inside Jamf Pro, is creating these smart groups without the parentheses. Because if you're creating patch definitions, you cannot rely on them. Anyway, wow! Sorry, I just looked at the time.
Sorry.
We have blown through this. So we don't have time for QA, so if anyone wants to grill us, you can grill us. So if all of that seems too much, there are a couple of projects out there. There is a community patch project, which is based on Bryson's patch server. So where the community are creating patch definitions and posting them in there. And the other option, oh, sir, there's the website as well, so you can know you're in the right place when you get there after you hit that URL. We're working on a subscription model to provide patch feeds for Kenobi servers as well. So that we have, I don't know, monitoring 1,200 or so titles. So there's a fairly goodly amount sitting in there that we keep reasonably current at the moment. We're working on improving that. This is why we're not live yet. But we're hoping to have that up very, very soon. So if you hit the Kenobi website, you can go there and you can register. Anyone who registers beforehand will get, basically as soon as we go live, it will be free for a while. I'm not sure of the exacting specs. I could get those. So there's one more thing that I'd like to bring up. So when we designed Kenobi, we implemented on the top of NetSUS. Now, if I say NetSUS, show of hands, how many people know what this is?
Cool.
All right, so for those of you who don't, Jamf did basically a Linux-based appliance that provided a software update server and a netboot server that you could just simply deploy. And we thought it was a good idea to put things on top of something from the Jamf open source community, because it was an open source product that worked with a Jamf product as well. And also, fundamentally, I'm too lazy to rewrite the entire UI component around managing the OS that this thing is running on the web server and everything else. And so this is, you may have noticed, anyone who is familiar with NetSUS, this is what it looks like. And we went and rewrote the entire web UI componentry anyway, and so we updated it to make it a nicer user experience and align the UI with Jamf Pro. And we added a stack of new features into it. So we updated the UI, we gave you the ability to enable and disable services, so if people want to deploy NetSUS as a dedicated Kenobi server, you can, or a dedicated SUS server, or a dedicated netboot server. We had added a whole bunch of additional system management features, like the ability to expand the underpinning storage from the web browser. We did a bunch of sanity checking on all of the input fields. We added a file sharing component, so now you can use this as a standard DOM file share for Jamf Pro. So in about 6 clicks, you can have a file share up and running as a Jamf Pro local distribution point on a self-contained Linux appliance. We had added the ability to filter the software update catalogs because the footprint of SUS is enormous, but if you can clip it down to the OSs you're supporting, it gets a little better. And just before NetBoot dies, we added multiple NBI support to it. So, something probably should have done a couple of years ago, but just didn't get around to it. And there's a bunch of other things. But we are going to have plenty of time for questions if you would like to ask us anything. Mm-hmm. Anyone?
Hi, sorry, I missed the very beginning, so if it's covered already, I'm not sure. But so there's a disconnect between patch and regular policies. Patch can only update, can't install things
Correct.
that aren't already there.
Yeah.
Do you have any? In your fields, are you automating the creation of the regular policies that install from if it's not already there?
So from our perspective, we have some pretty big plans for what we're going to do with Kenobi. So we're going to put up a cloud offering. We're also going to see if we can marry it up to automating the import of the patch definitions to create the patch policies and potentially importing the packages into the Jamf Pro DP and enabling the initial install policy as well as turning on the update policies that follow it. But that's a little way into the future yet.
Right, yeah.
But trying to reduce that down to about 3 or 4 clicks.
Awesome. And I guess the other thing is we rely on AutoPackage for everything.
Yeah.
And haven't yet got my head around how I'd write a post processor or something to write the patch definition that from AutoPackage.
That's actually a really good thing because so one of our plans involves putting an API for injecting data into it.
Yeah.
But because everything is a unique and individual whatever, that not every title runs the same way. And so the information, you would have to effectively create a part of AutoPackage that had the recipe definition in it for creating the patch definition as well.
Yeah.
So it's twofold because you might have a version string that doesn't marry up to the human readable part. You also have to do a serious amount of lookups and things like that. Like one classic example is Adobe Photoshop is maintained. It's one of their few products that they maintain the current version and they still patch the previous version. And so the release times and the insertion points for the title, so you have to figure out separation points and all of that sort of stuff. It can get really tricky. So yes, we are exploring it. We haven't done it yet in the initial open source or anything like that because it is incredibly difficult. And especially when you have a huge sample set of data to look at, you just realize that there's nothing that you can do it with.
Good luck.
Cool. Thank you.
So super beginner question. I haven't really done anything with patch management yet.
Yep.
Our process is we have about 20 or so applications, and just every month or two we'll check with those vendors to see if they got an updated version of it.
Yep.
What is the big draw to going through this process of getting all that data in there to have it do this type of patch management if you're doing 20 or so applications?
Well, 20 or so applications is probably easier than doing 100 to start with.
Yeah.
And of those 20 or so, I would say that probably you would have 10 that would be in the standard Jamf patch set. So then your subset is coming down to about 10. And so Kenobi is actually a fairly good fit for you because you only have a few definitions to initially create. Because remember, you only have to create the patch objects, and then it's just populating the data inside of those. And in probably 70% of the cases, it's a relatively simple process that you can put 2 values on the clipboard and just bang through it in a few minutes. Okay. So you can update some, you check in with the vendor, you put in the updated version information, whatever packaging method you're using, you bring the package in, you marry up the package with the versioning information in the patch policy, and you press go, and then a whole bunch of other stuff is taken care of for you, which is the scoping of the smart groups and other bits and pieces to patch the title. So there are benefits in reducing the workflow further down the chain, but you still have to do some work somewhere at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
So I have two questions. One relates to extension attributes, and so I don't have a NetSUS, so I can't use the Kenobi tool. So right now I've got the Bryson's patch
Cool.
server set up,
That's right.
and so with the JSON files, and
I'm neutral today.
fair enough. So with the JSON files, I was looking in the extension attributes of one that already exists, and the extension attribute isn't readable. Is there an easy way to create the extension attribute?
So you can do this. Basically, Google base64 encode, and you'll find some online encoders, and they will give you a text field that you can paste a bunch of text in and press encode. I believe Python has a library that does that as well, so you can point it at a file and spit out a base64 encoded string for it. Not 100% sure on that, because the way we do it in the definitions, you paste the script in, and the server itself handles the encoding and decoding of it. But we store the script raw in the database, and we only encode it on its way out to Jamf Pro.
Okay, so it's base64, and you only need the script in there, the actual data.
Yeah, only the script. So
Okay.
just the script into any form of base64 encoder, and it should work.
Perfect. And then the second question relates inside the Jamf UI.
Yep.
Are there any plans for maybe a supported version being the latest version, so that when you're looking at a dashboard and you see a bunch of red because you're 2 versions behind, is there any way to say this is our supported version, make that the one that says green?
Right. That's a current feature request right now, too. You probably upvoted that already.
I did not, so I didn't know that was out there. So great.
We don't know the number of that feature request, but go upvote it.
Okay.
But it is in the plans, right? We've heard that from the community as well, is to set your own latest version and report on that. And so it's not, you're right, your graphs get all red because everyone's out of date, but maybe you're only supporting a two or so versions behind, right?
Yeah. Mind you, if you're running an external source,
Don't have
There you
new
go.
ones.
That's
you
right.
just don't put the new versions
You
in
just
there.
create your own
Exactly.
definition
So
there
you
and
get
then
control.
take that. That's right.
But we don't want to recreate something that's already in the Jamf one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
I
Perfect.
can
Thank you.
understand that.
I had 2 questions. The first one was Chrome. They update all the time, like daily. So I'm in a school district. Right now, we're just using an extension attribute that basically look against the website and pulling it from there. So if it's not meeting that definition, then it just downloads and updates.
Yep.
How, on that particular one, how does your system work? Because it would definitely be more than 10.
Oh, yeah.
I think on Jamp right now it's like 100 almost versioning.
Yeah, I really don't know. So, like, as in the number of versions, but well, I should probably give you some history about the company. Where we do packaging. That's how we started, and we do lots of it. And so, obviously, patches are like something that's going to be very important to us now. But we have processes that automatically create the version of Google Chrome. We extract the data from that. The data goes in from that perspective. But at the moment, there's nothing that's connecting all of that up yet. We're just monitoring feeds like everyone else.
But in the future, you guys might be making a package so we, if we went with Kenobi, it could direct to a package that's already built into the system.
Yes, absolutely.
And the
So that is definitely on the roadmap.
Oh, well, that's great. Second question is, right now we're using caching Mac Minis for all our file servers and trying to cache through them. With how Apple has gone in the direction of basically killing server.
Yep.
We're thinking about Linux or making virtual Linux on those boxes since we already have them in there.
Yep.
So the net source that you were talking about that Kenobi can sit on top of.
Yep.
Have you guys played with that through a virtual on a Mac?
Yeah, well, every time I build it because it's on my laptop, but not in a production environment. Normally sit it on ESXi or anything like that, but it'll import into any virtualization environment. It runs quite solidly. It's got a really low footprint. The initial default footprint of the OVA is 2 gig of RAM and 2 CPUs, but it's not that intense. You can back it right down. The VMDK will blow out to about 500 gig once you cache all of the software updates. But that's where you can limit it and do things like that. And if you're leveraging caching server and you've got enough space, but the I/O is pretty good. So you could potentially do that, but I would consider moving it off to something a little more serious.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
No worries.
So I guess I'll follow the trend and ask two questions, right? So, and I did come in a little late, so if you covered this, so we're clearly not the subject matter experts on patches here. The vendors are. So are we offering the vendors any way to contribute to this? So it would be really great if, Microsoft and Adobe are sort of our offenders here, right? And so Adobe patches some bizarre forms of XML files that could be transmogrified into something that looks like a patch, or they could just stink and put in their build chain and contribute to the patch, right? So are we, evangelizing them in any way from terms of either Jamf or Kenobi or anybody for that matter?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go too far into this, but some vendors do provide release information about the products in advance, and so they will tell you what date, what version is coming out, and all of that sort of stuff. But so Microsoft can be a good example of this, and I'll get to the Adobe thing in a minute. So Microsoft can be a good example of this because they have the insider track and the fast track, and you see what the version's coming, but they only give you the major.minor release things, and sometimes the point. The actual version string that it comes out with that Jamf uses for its inventory data has a date stamp in it, which is like 18.10. And so you're not going to know that until it drops. And that is a problem with that. So it's very difficult to be proactive from that perspective. And this is why we were saying that the lookup mechanism is quite reactive, but it can be accurate. This is the issue that you have there. And with those, like the 64 and the 32-bit versions of Office, so one was released after the other, and it was flipping that it was saying that the 64-bit version was older than the 32-bit version when you were doing the straight string comparison. So that was a little tricky as well at that point in time. So with that, it can be, if you can get a stable feed from a vendor that provides you with some really good information, yes. But that's actually quite rare. On the Adobe front, so the XML feeds and all of that sort of stuff that comes in from that, and what comes into the Adobe Update Manager, which they've deprecated now, and RUM and a few other bits and pieces, those versions in there are the human-readable versions. The version strings in the products themselves bear little or no resemblance to those strings whatsoever. So that is just about impossible. I have a database with like 1,800 Adobe products in it that just have every version, every patch level, all of that. And if you filter it down to things that have the version that they publish and the version that is actually in there, about 30%.
Yeah, so, and I understand that's the state of things today, but my question is more along the lines are,
Are vendors engaging to give us that information?
So can we actually, obviously we're a large community. Jamp can arguably be the #1 system that could be doing iOS and macOS patching going forward.
Yep.
Can we say to them, here's our format, contribute to it, get on board?
Honestly, given
what
how
I'm
much
saying?
Microsoft are giving back at the moment, I think they would be into that. I don't know about Adobe. I've done some stuff, had some fairly in-depth conversations with their product management teams in the past about consistency with versioning info and things like that, but it's sort of been good and then gone away and then come good again in the past and things. But yes, I guess we could. We just get together as a community and slam them. Hit them up on Slack.
Not to go to solution, but if you just offered and said, hey,
Send us the info.
Let me give you a key and let you contribute to this as sort of the backside of that head.
That's a good idea.
That might be
we'll take that on board.
Okay.
That's actually a really good idea.
The other question, and I've talked a little bit to Jamf about this, is we keep some fairly, I'll say, sporadic data up in the third-party database on Jamf Nation about the updates, and so it's just sort of a community offering kind of thing.
Yeah.
That doesn't really have an API into it at this point in time, but it could be a mechanism that if you felt like you trusted it as a JSS administrator, you could go on to. Is anybody in Jamf looking into maybe opening that up as a patch source mechanism?
So we're the Jamf Nation team.
Yeah, we need the Jamf Nation team here. I think I've heard of that and that suggestion as well. I don't know if that's something that they're looking into, to try to use. I do know that they're supporting a lot of the community-based definitions and try to get, and that's why Bryson was so involved in creating his server, is to try to leverage the community for that. And since I think we struggle with having vendors come on board to support that, and so Yeah, I think there's a community movement towards that. But
I mean, even just an API that we could pull the data that's already in there out and sort of munge it and
Right,
put it
right.
back as patches might be extremely helpful.
I would suggest do a feature request for sure. You know, I think our Jamf Nation team could definitely get on that.
Yeah,
All right, thank you.
no worries.
You were first.
Oh boy.
Yeah, now we've got big customers.
So I apologize if I missed a mention of this in the presentation, but there is a community-driven solution that is out there called AutoPackage. And I'm wondering what work Jamf has done since last year. They were talking about perhaps including functionality for AutoPackage to be able to feed into Patch. Has there been any progress in that regards, and is there any planned initiatives to integrate AutoPackage into Patch?
Yeah.
So just so that Lucky doesn't have to commit to a question as a Jamf employee, and I am not, and I can say whatever I want. As far as I'm aware, no.
Yeah.
To both.
Yeah.
But we're working on filling that gap ourselves and providing APIs so that you can pass the data through from our perspective.
It just seems like a duplication of effort. I mean,
It does. Well, there's no effort going in one path.
It would be very helpful if we had an API method. I mean, right now there is a community solution called JSS Importer.
Yeah.
That is currently being supported as kind of a best effort kind of thing by a gentleman named Mosen in Australia. He's a very nice gentleman for taking on that, that
He's a very
task.
quiet gentleman too. You never know you're talking to him.
It's true, but he's very nice. But it would be very helpful if the vendor could provide that kind of API support for uploading packages and being able to send information via the API. Because then for those folks that are already using AutoPackage, we could implement that as just one more step in our workflow. Whereas right now it's just kind of, Patch for us is not that useful because we can get what we need from AutoPackage faster.
Yeah. Well, this is why we're actually... Thanks, Rich. And this is, like I said, this is why we're working on getting the API info and trying to figure out how we can get that data fed into there so that it can come through quick, so that you can actually have Kenobi as a pass-through node to do that sort of thing. That's our goal, is to handle that, so Jamf don't have to do it. And if they do it, then we are out of jobs.
Cool, thank you.
So Rich kind of asked some questions that semi-answered mine, but I just wanted to ask it to be clear. So does Kenobi's open source toolkit support API input to
Not yet.
JSON data?
Soon.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
You had mentioned the kill apps,
Yeah.
like having people lose their saved data and stuff like that. Is there a feature that's you're going to add where you can select the time you want the patch to deploy?
I don't know.
Oh, you're talking about maintenance windows?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. And
Yeah,
so I know that's
something
also a
like that.
feature request out there too, as well.
Okay.
And I think, yeah, so because you're trying, you want to deploy only during a certain period
Yeah,
of
it's
time,
a-
right?
yeah,
And to do that.
exactly, yeah.
And I know the policies do that right now, but patch policies don't.
Don't,
right?
yeah.
And so I would suggest you just go and continue to upvote that, so that
I'll
gets
upload
on
that.
our
That's
backlog.
actually, that's something that would affect me a lot.
Right, right.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I can't speak to product management, but
Yeah.
definitely upload the feature. They constantly monitor that, and then we can try to get that into the backlog.
In fact,
for us.
everyone who's here, let's just search Jamf Nation and upvote that feature as quick as
Yeah.
possible, because that's actually really
I think that's
important.
yes. I think that's like the
Go
highest,
team.
one of the highest. So
Ah,
yeah.
okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're out. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
That'll do it, guys.